On the evening of July 19th, 1940, Adolf Hitler stood at a lectern in the Kroll Opera House in Berlin and offered Britain a way out. He called it an appeal to reason. He spoke as a conqueror, and he expected an answer. That answer came roughly an hour later, broadcast over the radio by a man who had absolutely no authority to give it. It wasn't delivered by a diplomat, it wasn't cleared by the British government, and it left the men surrounding Hitler genuinely baffled. In the summer of 1940, almost no one in Berlin could comprehend why Britain would choose to be destroyed rather than come to terms. To understand Berlin's bewilderment, you have to step back 3 weeks into a room in London where Britain nearly made the opposite choice. It was late May 1940. The situation was catastrophic. The German army had torn through France in a matter of weeks. The British Expeditionary Force, the bulk of Britain's trained soldiers, was being pushed back toward a single port on the Channel coast, Dunkirk. Calais fell on the 26th. Belgium surrendered on the night of the 27th. The evacuation had barely begun, and no one in London knew if a single soldier would make it home. Winston Churchill had been Prime Minister for just 17 days, and in those days a fight had broken out inside the 5-man war cabinet that the British public wouldn't learn about for decades. The Foreign Secretary was Lord Halifax. He was tall, austere, deeply experienced, and until recently, the front-runner for the Prime Ministership, a job he had turned down. Looking at the map, the collapse of France, and the trapped army on the beaches, Halifax reached a conclusion many reasonable men shared. Britain should at least find out what terms were available. He had a route. Italy hadn't yet entered the war, and Mussolini might be persuaded to broker a deal. On May 25th, Halifax had already met with the Italian ambassador in London, quietly suggesting that Italy's concerns could be folded into a wider European settlement. He was opening a door. Churchill wanted that door shut and bolted. His argument wasn't purely about courage, it was about the trap. The moment Britain sat at the negotiating table, Germany would dictate the terms. They would demand the fleet, naval bases, complete disarmament. Britain would be reduced to a slave state, a puppet entirely dependent on Hitler's goodwill. Better, Churchill argued, to keep fighting while the RAF and Royal Navy remained intact, because those two forces could still stop an invasion. Over 3 days, the War Cabinet met 9 times, moving between Admiralty House, the Downing Street Cabinet Room, and the House of Commons. The most dangerous moment came on the afternoon of Monday, May 27th. Halifax felt Churchill was talking, in his own words, the most frightful rot. That evening, Halifax confided to his diary that he was seriously considering resignation. This threat was real, and it was lethal. Churchill's government was days old. If Halifax walked out, taking the Conservative Party with him, the government would collapse, and a new administration might well choose to talk. 2 things saved Churchill's position. The first was Neville Chamberlain. The former Prime Minister, forever associated with Munich, still led the Conservative Party, and his support could make or break Churchill in Parliament. At the start of the crisis, Chamberlain sat in the middle. By the 28th, he had come down on Churchill's side. Fight on. Because of his hold over Conservative MPs, this shift mattered more than any speech. The second thing was a room full of men Churchill sought out on his own. On the evening of the 28th, Churchill called together the wider government, around 25 ministers outside the inner war cabinet, and spoke to them plainly. He told them Britain would get no better terms by negotiating now than by fighting it out. According to the diary of Hugh Dalton, who was in the room, Churchill ended with this: "If this Long Island story of ours is to end at last, let it end only when each one of us lies choking in his own blood upon the ground." The ministers cheered. Several leaped up, running around the table to clap him on the back. In that room, in secret, the idea of negotiation died and never returned. Churchill couldn't afford to sack Halifax. He needed Conservative unity, so he kept him as Foreign Secretary and simply carried on. That was the decision. Not a slogan, not a foregone conclusion, but a choice made behind closed doors against a serious faction that wanted to talk. What the public heard was only the defiance. On June 4th, as the last men came off the Dunkirk beaches, Churchill stood in the Commons and declared Britain would fight on the beaches, in the fields, in the streets, and would never surrender. On June 18th, he told them the Battle of France was over and the Battle of Britain was about to begin. On June 22nd, France signed its armistice with Germany in a railway carriage at Compiègne, the exact spot where Germany had signed its own surrender in 1918. Britain now stood completely alone. And this is where the two sides of the story stopped matching up, because in Berlin, they were reading all of this and drawing the opposite conclusion. After the fall of France, the mood across Germany, from Hitler down to the ordinary infantryman, was that the war in the West was essentially over. France was beaten. The British army had abandoned its guns, tanks and trucks on the beaches. What rational government, staring at those facts, would keep fighting alone? Hitler expected London to come to its senses. He waited. For weeks he delayed any formal move against Britain, expecting a signal, a message, a phone call. It never came. By mid-July, his patience was gone. On July 16th, he issued Führer Directive No. 16, ordering preparations for Operation Sea Lion, the invasion of Britain. Its opening line dripped with confusion, as England, in spite of the hopelessness of her military position, has so far shown herself unwilling to come to any compromise. I have decided to prepare for, and if necessary to carry out, an invasion of England. The hopelessness of her military position, that was Berlin's honest assessment. They believed Britain was already beaten, and simply refused to admit it. 3 days later, Hitler made one final attempt to make the British see reason, and he turned it into a spectacle. The Riksdag gathered on the evening of Friday, July 19th, at the Kroll Opera House. Hitler combined the session with a victory celebration for the conquest of France. Before making his peace offer, he handed out rewards. In a single ceremony, he promoted 12 generals to the rank of Field Marshal, a massive batch, deliberately handed out all at once. Rundstedt, Bock, Brauchitsch, Keitel, Kesselring, Milch, and he went further. Hermann Göring, already a field marshal, was elevated to an entirely new rank invented for him alone, Reichsmarschall, nominally making him the senior officer of the entire armed forces and confirming him as Hitler's chosen successor. Watching from the diplomatic seats was American radio correspondent William Shirer. He knew Hitler's performances well, writing that night that the Hitler he saw was the conqueror, conscious of it, and yet so wonderful an actor, so magnificent a handler of the German mind. Nearby sat the Italian foreign minister, Count Galeazzo Ciano, in the grey and black uniform of the fascist militia. Every time Hitler paused for breath, Ciano leaped up like a jack-in-the-box to give the fascist salute, clutching a text of the speech he probably couldn't even understand. Then, Hitler made his appeal. He was careful to frame it not as a plea, but as generosity from a position of absolute strength. "I am not the vanquished begging favours," he said, but the victor speaking in the name of reason. He could see no reason for the war to continue. And then he came to the heart of it, the passage that hung over everything. "A great empire will be destroyed," he said. "An empire that it was never my intention to destroy, or even to harm. This struggle, if it continues, can end only with the complete annihilation of one or the other of the two adversaries." He laid out the choice: come to terms or be annihilated. He mixed this with contempt for Churchill personally, sneering that when Germany won, Churchill would already be safe in Canada, where the money and children of the warmongers had supposedly been sent. To the diplomats in the hall, it sounded dangerous, precisely because it sounded reasonable. There were no harsh, detailed demands. It was vague, a broad invitation to be sensible. Some foreign observers worried the British might seize on it as an excuse to open talks. The German press and radio presented it exactly as intended, a magnanimous offer from a victor to a beaten foe. And then, back in London, a man sat in a BBC studio and listened. His name was Sefton Delmer, a British journalist born in Berlin. He was a native German speaker working for the BBC's German service. He heard the speech live, and without asking anyone, without a shred of authorization from the British government, he went on the air in German and answered Hitler directly. "Herr Führer," he said, "we hurl your words right back at you, right in your evil-smelling teeth." He threw the offer away on the spot, on behalf of no one, roughly an hour after Hitler sat down, long before any minister had said a word. The effect in Berlin was almost comic. Around Scherer, German officials were dumbfounded. They had genuinely expected acceptance, or at least an opening. Scherer noted a sense of ill-concealed disappointment spreading through the Germans in the hall. Goebbels and his propaganda ministry were so thrown by the speed and savagery of Delmer's reply that they assumed it had to be official, that this must be the voice of the British government itself. It was the opposite. A single broadcaster had spoken out of turn, but because it was so fast and so blunt, it carried more weight than any careful diplomatic note ever could. The Nazis didn't forget him. Sefton Delmer's name was added to the Gestapo's arrest list. the so-called Black Book of Britons, to be seized the moment German troops landed. 3 days later came the formal answer, and the irony was complete. On July 22nd, the official British rejection was delivered by radio, not by Churchill, but by Lord Halifax. The very man who in May had wanted to explore terms now stood before a microphone and slammed the door. Hitler's speech, he said, offered no basis in justice and no recognition of the right of nations to govern themselves. Halifax added that Hitler's only appeal was to the base instinct of fear, and his only argument was a threat. "We shall not stop fighting," he concluded, "until freedom for ourselves and others is secure." And the leader of the peace faction had become the voice of refusal. With no acceptance coming, the Germans printed the speech in English under the title **, a last appeal to reason **. In early August, the Luftwaffe scattered the leaflets over the English countryside, over Somerset, Hampshire, and the fields near Stratford-upon-Avon. The British treated them as a joke. Some were gathered up and auctioned off for the Red Cross and the Spitfire Fund, and so the annihilation Hitler had promised was put to the test. Through August, the Luftwaffe threw itself at the RAF. Eagle Day came on August 13th. On September 7th, the bombers turned on London, and the Blitz began, night after night, over British cities. This was the destruction Britain had chosen to risk, rather than negotiate. But the RAF was not broken. Air superiority never came. On September 17th, with the sky still contested, Hitler postponed Operation Sea Lion indefinitely. It was pushed back and quietly shelved. The invasion never came. The men in this story went their separate ways. Chamberlain, who cast the swing vote to fight on, was already dying of cancer. He resigned that autumn and was gone by November 9th, 1940, months after making perhaps the most important decision of his life. Halifax was sent to Washington as ambassador that December, serving out the war. Ciano, the jack-in-the-box of the diplomatic seats, was executed in 1944 by Mussolini's own regime. Goering, the new Reichsmarshal whose air force failed over Britain, was condemned at Nuremberg and swallowed cyanide the night before he was to hang. And Sefton Delmer, the man who answered a conqueror without permission, spent the rest of the war running Britain's fake German radio stations, whispering into Germany in its own voice. Berlin had asked a simple question, expecting a simple answer. What it got, an hour later, from a man speaking out of turn, was the shape of the next 5 years.